Hello all and welcome to Critical Faculty. Today we're going to talk about the Old Testament and Moses. And I've got a couple of interesting personas. One is that of the philosophical persuasion and a scientific brain combined together and apparently writing a book about Moses. Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Aaron. How are you guys?
I'm very well, thank you, Hattie. It's great to be back with you after a long hiatus, and actually a long hiatus from the world of critical analysis of religions. And so today, before I let Aaron say hello, I will say I'll be allowing Aaron to do the heavy lifting of the thinking today, as I've spent 3 years in geopolitics. But we are writing a book, and it is a book that should hopefully be fascinating. It's going to cover an awful lot of ground, called The Exodus: A Critical Examination of the Moses Story. We'll talk about the book in a little while, but my brain is a little bit rusty, so hopefully this will help to lubricate the cogs.
No, fair enough. How about you, Aaron? What you been up to?
Been keeping myself busy with my day job, but also this book project has been quite the whirlwind, and it has become very interesting and exciting. I have explored things that I never expected to have done so, and actually the fun thing is, because of this project that Jonathan and I have been doing together, it's actually led to some cutting-edge research that is going to be a part of this book project. So this won't just be simply a rehash of 80 reasons to doubt the Old Testament. This will be actually pushing scholarship forward, as well as giving you that intro to Bible that you may not have gotten in Sunday school.
Right. So I've got a proposition to make, because I got to know about this from Jonathan, that this is a fantastic sort of piece of work, and I don't think we're going to pay justice by covering it in one episode. So how about today we cover the whole thing generically, and then we can always dissect it in piece by piece and sort of delve in and zoom in the details. How about that? Not a bad idea?
Really reasonable.
Can do.
Right. Well, let's start from like Ricky Gervais have said in one of his stand-up comedies. Let's start from the beginning, like God did.
So for me, I mean, the genesis of this book, to coin a phrase, the genesis of this book was, I'd written a book previously. My first book of biblical exegesis was The Nativity: A Critical Examination. And then I wrote The Resurrection: A Critical Examination of the Easter Story. And the reason I wanted to write those books is because, in terms of like the Jesus story, those are the two parts of Jesus' life that interact with history very well, or at least more explicitly than any other point in his life. So between birth and death, actually, there's no corroboration of anything he did, really, from an extra biblical historical point of view. But with the birth, you've got Herod, and you've got, the claims of the wise men, and all these sort of things that you can look at from outside of the Bible and say, okay, did this happen? Is it plausible? There's a census. Okay. And then the resurrection, we've got the Pontius Pilate and the burial techniques and whatnot of the Jewish traditions, and lots of other sort of stuff in there. And you can see that Jesus' life interacted with history at those 2 points. And if you show that at those 2 points we are not justified in believing the historical claims of the New Testament, then of course that leaves the Christian going, well, okay, well, what do I do now? How am I justified in believing all that's in the middle that doesn't intersect with history? But then the third pillar here, and the more foundation, actually, maybe the keystone to the Jesus story, is the Old Testament upon which that is built. And particularly the Exodus story, which is the story of Moses, and Jesus is arguably the new Moses, particularly if you look at the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew sees Jesus as a kind of, the new Moses. So if we look at the Exodus account, which intersects with history in really much more considerable ways, or doesn't, like should intersect with history, then if we find it to be a problematic account of what supposedly took place, then not only does Christianity have no foundation, but actually, really, Judaism has no foundation either. It's such a foundational book, the Book of Exodus. So that's the kind of third book in the trilogy of trying to pull the rug out from under, I guess, Jewish and Christian thinkers and believers.
A question for Aaron here. Consciousness have evolved, in us, and we've realized that we're going to die, and we sort of developed sort of a savior complex over time. That it keeps repeating itself. This savior theme, and I'm going to borrow from Jordan Peterson and talk about archetype of the savior that keeps coming. Be it God Himself being one of His messengers, the Übermensch, the Superman. That particular person who can do certain things that nobody could, and saves the day. Is the fascination of that particular figure is a centerpiece in the Jewish theology and other theologies?
In some ways, there's an import into the Jewish stories of that, because so many of, like, say, the prophets of the Old Testament are just like, oh, woe is us. God, could you spare us a little bit from these Babylonians or what have you? It's the Moses character that really comes along and basically, well, goes all Charlton Heston on them, standing at the Red Sea, slamming to the ground and saying, "You shall not pass." Okay, I might be mixing a few characters, but that's the sort of thing we get from the Moses figure in many ways, but is kind of absent from many others outside of the big 5 books of the Bible. So there's kind of an interesting change to what the hero is in that kind of story, even though I'm trying to think of like other exemplars, like the Gilgamesh character from Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian mythos, who's also, an Übermensch, but basically also has to learn, man, life sucks, I don't want to die. Oh crap, I'm going to die anyways. Let me do something good before I'm finally gone.
But that's really important, of course, because you're already starting to talk about mythical tropes here, with reference to other contemporaneous mythology. So the question really is Moses a real historical figure? Was he a real historical figure? And if so, to what degree? And, the obvious alternative is that he was a mythological or mythic figure, and the stories were developed over time. And we can argue as to how the story developed, but there are certainly very many mythic tropes that exist around the story of Moses, and it's fascinating looking at them. But it's very obvious to people from outside of the faith looking in at Moses from a kind of scare quotes objective point of view to see these mythic tropes. The problem is when you are born and brought up within Judeo-Christian culture, you apply those kind of skeptical critical analyses to other religions. So you look at Islam and say, well, that's obviously not true, it didn't happen, blah blah blah, but you don't do it to your own religion. It's the kind of John Loftus's outsider test for faith. You need to take yourself outside of your religion to then look back at that religion and say, oh yeah, actually, those claims in the Exodus and those claims about Moses are absolutely ridiculous. And I'm not trying to be harsh here, they are stupendously ridiculous, and they are incredible, as in they are not credible.
What about somewhere in between? Because the same thing, the same allegations happen with Jesus. Jesus is a historical person or not? Muhammad a historical person or not? What about somewhere in between, where I can quite easily imagine a situation where the Egyptians, where they're building the pyramids, and there's some sort of a minority expats, right, living in Egypt at the time, being a cosmopolitan country, attracting laborers and people who want to to make an earning. And there was a situation, a fight sort of erupted between a couple of people. One of them is an expat, and the other one is a national local, right? And a guy who stood up and said, you can't slap him, he's too weak, or where you guess something of that sort. Then that particular person on the floor look up at Moses or whatever that person is, like, oh, what a fantastic, situation to be, and then exaggerate that conversation to mean something a lot bigger. Same situation with Jesus, same situation with Muhammad. So somebody who actually existed did a couple of things similar to what's been alleged, but exaggerated magnificently in the human brain.
A big part of that's going to come down to what's the time gap between the figure and the stories to them. With Jesus, at least, you got Paul writing within a couple of decades, the Gospels within a century. But for Moses, it's an open question what our oldest source is, and it will go back to, well, like, how do you actually date the various parts of the books that Moses originally or allegedly wrote? If Moses wrote them, well, then it's an eyewitness report. But if you believe what almost all trained scholars in this will tell you, these are actually multiple sources that were cobbled together over centuries, probably no earlier than the 8th century BC, which would put it at least 300 or more years after any alleged time of a Moses figure. And that's the best case scenario. Some of the case that I've been putting forward is it might actually be 1,000-year gap between the time where Moses is placed historically and the stories we have about him.
Of course, and the more time lapses, the bigger the exaggerations.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to answer whether there was a historical kernel of truth to the Moses character. Was there a person who took a couple of slaves out of Egypt? Maybe, but we can neither confirm nor disconfirm that really with the evidence we have. I mean, the problem with the Moses story and the Exodus, the book of Exodus, is that there is no extra biblical confirmation of the accounts at all. Like, there is no evidence outside of the Bible, so it's very much this kind of circular situation, or this very much using the Bible to prove the Bible. And then when you start understanding how archaeology used to happen, like these biblical maximalists, people that said, right, everything in the Bible is true, effectively, therefore when we go and do archaeology, what we find is going to accord with what we know is true in the Bible. And then when you understand the people that were originally doing the archaeology were seminary funded, so you had religious institutions funding people to go out to Israel and Palestine, wherever, and go and do the digs in order to find things that proves the Bible, but then they're using the Bible as the date, the kind of the framework, the benchmark. So when they find something, it's like, oh yeah, this proves that, rather than, no, we're not going to use the Bible, we're going to do some archaeology and then derive our conclusions from that, rather than use this to confirm our already held prejudged conclusions. And so the whole thing is just a little bit problematic in terms of trying to decipher the truth.
I don't mind starting with a premise. That's fine. It happens even in science. Richard Feynman's explanation of what science is quite wonderful. First, you guess it, and people start laughing, and I don't mind that at all. You can guess a conclusion, but you must abandon it if it doesn't conform with actual findings. People forget I'm half Egyptian, so I lived in Egypt for a bit. And, I'm not as old. I mean, I was born in 1972. So just a year after was the 1973 Liberation War. We got Sinai back. And between the 1967 and 1973, Israel went into the peninsula of Egypt, of Sinai, to canvass the area. And I think Israel Finkelstein wrote about this. They couldn't find a thing. And we're talking about, in excess of 1 million people. with their sheep and herds, and so we're talking maybe a couple of generations, giving the average lifespan around that time, and they needed to eat, drink, and the fact that they couldn't find a thing, isn't that a bit curious?
Aaron, do you want to explain a valid, sound application of the argument from silence?
Yeah. Yeah. So first, let's talk about the scale of what the narrative suggests, and if not finding evidence for that should actually make us do more than just scratch our heads a little bit. So according to the book of Exodus and in the book of Numbers, we are told not just that the Israelites leave slavery from Egypt, but we are given numbers. Our two major sources in there that have the labels J, P, E, and D traditionally. The J source says about 600,000 army-aged men left Egypt with their families, and an untold number of other people went with them as well. Later in Numbers, there are multiple censuses of all those fighting-aged men. And so we're looking at about 600,000 men, strapping young men able to hold swords and that. And if you just think just very conservatively, they got a wife, they got a couple kids, there's probably others coming along. We're talking at least 2.5 million people going out of Egypt, which would have been at that time approximately the entire population of Egypt, staying in the desert for 40 years,
with
wandering
animals.
about with animals, and then eventually invading what they refer to the Holy Land, Canaan, completely destroying dozens and dozens of cities, burning things down all over the place, and then bringing in this gigantic new population into a place that, by the way, never held a population of more than 1 million until modern times because there isn't enough water. People like water. I've checked.
Added to which, Aaron, of course, you have the enslavery of those people in Egypt anyway, and then you have all of these extraordinary claims to do with the plagues that there should be some evidence of. I mean, the claims are, and we'll talk about this probably a bit later, but the death of all firstborn humans and animals. In fact, multiple deaths of all the animals, and so. So continue on the argument from silence.
I was going to say, I've got to apologize for our very own Zahi Hawass conversation with what's his name, with Rogan, Joe Rogan. He had a conversation about the building of the pyramids, and it was an embarrassing conversation. So I'm gonna apologize on behalf of all Egyptians. But we have records of Egyptians building the pyramids, including the names of the supervisors and the amount of foods they had per day, including beer. Yes, Egypt. We've invented beer, and not the Irish. The other side of me. So the allocations of food, and every single evidence directs points at these people were labor. They were paid. They love doing it, and you've got to be sort of a privilege to do it, because this is like it's a holy site. You're building for the king, who's the reincarnation of God on earth. You're getting paid, you're getting good food, you're getting good housing. So it was like the dream. It's like trying to go and work for Microsoft or something like that of the times. So there is very little evidence to show that this was done under a situation where people were being whipped to labor on the building of the pyramids.
Yeah. And it's also probably worth noting, Egyptian history is absurdly long. We are actually closer to the last pharaoh of Egypt than the last pharaoh of Egypt was to the construction of the pyramids. And the alleged time of the Exodus was about 1,000 years after the construction of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. So just absurdly long amounts of time between things. So no, not even in legend did the Jews build the pyramids. That was done and dusted and old hat by the time, allegedly, the descendants of Abraham were living in Egypt, and then just of getting some help leaving. But to get back to the argument from silence, is it a valid argument to basically say, hey, we checked the desert, there's no sign of massive hordes of people moving through? And the argument will be, it's like, well, absence of evidence is not absence of evidence of absence, but that is a cliche that is very wrong. So let's just take an absurd example. there is definitely an absence of evidence of there being a pachyderm in my room. Me not seeing the pachyderm should be very strong evidence that there is not an elephant in this room, because if it were, I would have noticed. It would have been obviously expected. And in this sort of case, is it the case that we should expect evidence to be left by millions of people moving through and staying at certain locations for years and years and years? And according, again, to the Bible itself, it says that they stayed in a particular location that we can identify archaeologically, Kadesh Barnea, and the source of how long they were there is a little bit confusing, but at least suggests a long time. They were in one location. This was also the burial site of important people, including Miriam, Moses' sister. Thousands of people were supposed to have died and eaten and all sorts of things. And we've gone there, and archaeologists have dug through and looked specifically at the layers that would have been before the time of the Exodus, the layers after the time of Exodus, and in the time you would expect the Exodus to have happened, which according to the Bible is itself in the 15th century BCE. Egyptologists will probably say it's better fitting the 13th or 13th century BCE. In that time frame, nothing. Not just a little bit, nothing. No signs of habitation, no signs of a mass horde of people going through, and definitely no signs of a royal burial of the sister of the leader of this people.
One last question, Aaron.
So I was just going to say, and no sign of anything that takes place in the entirety of the Exodus account, right? So from the beginning to the end, so what the maxim is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but that is actually incorrect when you would expect there to be evidence. So really the maxim should be that when you absolutely expect there to be evidence, a lack of evidence is actually disconfirmatory of the original claim. So as Aaron said, with the elephant situation, if I got back from holiday, right, and my neighbour Jill said, or Doris said, there was an earthquake 7.5 on the Richter scale yesterday. I'm like, really? No one talked about it when I got back from the airport. And then I go and look around. She said, yeah, absolutely crazy, massive earthquake all over. It was crazy. And then I walk around the town. There's no rubble. There's no cracks, there's no broken buildings, no windows broken. I go and ask people, no one says they don't know anything about it. So that absence of evidence is actually disconfirmation of her claim. I'm justified to go back to her and say, look, hang on, there's absolutely no evidence for this massive thing that you claim that took place. You can't say to me, well, just because there is an evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. No, that there is no evidence when I'd absolutely expect there to be evidence is disconfirmation of that claim from being true.
That argument is quite misused. It reminds me of the agnosticism situation of people think it's a 50-50 situation, even though Thomas Huxley meant something completely different at the time it was coined. It's coined based. I mean, I can understand it within the universe type of situation or outside of the universe because you cannot statistically canvass the area. But we're talking about an area that is contained. It's not a huge area. That it's not beyond the realm of excavation and things like that. So at that point, it becomes a very, very poor area. But let's say they find something at some point, then we can easily adjust our expectations. But you don't live your life thinking, oh, I cannot prove the non-existence of leprechauns or unicorns, but you don't live your life accordingly as if the one exists until it's proven the other way around. You live as if they don't exist. It's like the teapot that is orbiting Jupiter, according to Russell. There may be, I don't know, but I'm not going to live my life according to that.
So I'll lead this on to Aaron talking about maybe Manetho and Hecataeus and whatnot, but essentially the argument from silence is also can also be applied to a much wider set of data, or at least missing data, so non-data. So not only is there no archaeological evidence, not only is there no contemporaneous claims to confirm or to support the claims of in the Book of Exodus, but there are also other little snippets. So there's no evidence of laws being adhered to given Moses was a lawgiver. So at the time, you'd expect people to be following the laws that are set out in Exodus that say, this is what people believe back here, and this is what God was dictating back here. Actually, there's no evidence that people were following those laws, and we can talk about the Elephantine Papyri and all sorts in a while. There was no one called Moses. So when you get like big father figures of religion, like very soon after they are established as father figures, everyone's called like Muhammad, right? How many people are called Muhammad now, right? How many people are called Moses now? Quite a lot of people are called Moses. So actually, the name Moses just didn't exist until like way later. And that's something that definitely Aaron could talk about. There's no reference to any lawgiver in the form of Moses in any other text. Like the Greeks would talk about different lawgivers quite often. And in the time period we're talking about, you start hearing about Moses a lot later, but not in the time frames that you would want if you're a biblical literalist. And without kind of Moses, you don't, as mentioned earlier, you don't get Judaism, I don't think. So this is really, really important stuff, but there's just a complete lack of anything that would verify this story. And the Bible seems to be familiar with Hellenistic texts, like Greek Empire texts, right? But those Hellenistic texts are not familiar with the biblical claims, and I think that dynamic is super important. Anyway, over to Aaron for Manetho and Hecataeus and stuff.
Just on the Moses situation, from my understanding, that I find it very peculiar that there are a lot of other prophets before Moses, but for some reason God keeps it orally. It's an oral tradition. There are no books to talk about. There are no writings, no codes, more sort of interactions of circumstantial situations. The Noah, the Israel situation, the Jacob and his wrestling with God, or the Spirit of God, or the angel of God, who knows. Weird stuff happening, and only at Moses' time, this is the first time that allegedly God writes with his own fingertips, the Ten Commandments. And finally we find something written, something concrete to talk about. And then we have the Torah, the first five books of the Old Testament, and then the writings later on of Judges and Works and later on. Why was there?
But all of that still 700 years after Moses was supposedly alive.
Yeah,
so although you say, and then we have the writing, well, actually we don't. What we do is we have maybe oral traditions at
over
most.
time. Yeah. Over time. So it wasn't. Yeah, but I'm saying, why did God wait? Close to. What's the age of the earth and the universe according to some Christians? Is it 6,000 years, 5,800 something, some weird number? Why was there such a period where there are a lot of prophets and a lot of action? There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but there was no writings whatsoever. And suddenly God decides, okay, let's write everything that has happened in the past, but we're going to take 700 years to write them. How do you find that, Aaron?
All the harder considering the language that the story is in is a language that did not exist at the time of the Exodus. So specifically Hebrew, we don't actually find evidence of it existing as a distinct language from other Canaanite languages until very, very roughly 1000 BC. So this is a few centuries after any alleged Exodus date. And we don't even find evidence of literacy in places like Judea until no earlier than the 8th century BC, which is a bit surprising if, we're supposed to, have these things written down by Moses himself or by God, and nobody has writing in this region for centuries. So saying, well, it's oral, it's like your book said it was written down. That's already a bit odd, and we could throw a few things onto there. So when it comes to the interesting lack of mention of Moses in external sources, I actually found very surprising the lack of Moses in the Old Testament, because if you go through the prophets, you go to the oldest ones like Amos and Hosea, they know about an Exodus tradition, never mention Moses. Isaiah, the great prophet from Judea, or from the southern kingdom of Judah, doesn't even know about the Exodus tradition, let alone Moses. You go later, Jeremiah, like one of the last prophets before the exile, he knows about an Exodus tradition And in the authentic parts of his writing, no Moses. And I have to say the authentic parts because other people went back and like crammed a bunch of stuff into Jeremiah and say, look how awesome he is, how awesome a prophet he is, look what he said about us, even though it's somebody inserting stuff centuries later. But the authentic stuff, as we can tell, no Moses. In Ezekiel, no Moses. In the later addition to Isaiah called Second Isaiah, no Moses. We have to wait more than half a millennium of prophets until any of these guys even finally use that name. And if he's supposed to be the most important person in all of Jewish history, that's weird.
So you've got two competing hypotheses. Like one is that he existed in the reality that the Book of Exodus dictates, right? And then you have to start explaining why didn't they talk about him, or he didn't exist in that reality and was a later fabrication. In which case, that very adequately explains why he wasn't mentioned in the other books in the Old Testament. And this is a problem, and the issue for theists of Judeo-Christian theists is that they are, they have motivated reasoning to believe the least probable explanation here of the data, because if they don't, then the whole belief system falls apart. But for us looking from the outside, we can go to what is the most probable explanation of the data.
So let's talk a little bit about the life of Moses in Egypt.
Actually, so before we do that, there are just some really foundational elements that need to be kind of laid out before we start analyzing the parts of the story. So one we've already gone through is the argument from silence, which is super important. It's to say that there is just nothing. So are we justified in believing this given that there's no confirmatory evidence? But tied to that is the maxim that we hear from Carl Sagan and others, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this is really, really important because the maxim is justifiable. Like I challenge anyone that doesn't adhere to that maxim to actually put it into practice. To, like, if I told you the most ridiculous story about my life, right, as if it was true, like that I flew to the moon on the back of a donkey, right, while speaking to a unicorn, you'd be like, you wouldn't believe that because it's an extraordinary claim. And in order for you to believe that, you'd need video evidence. You probably need to see it firsthand. And even then, you need to know that you weren't on drugs and all this kind of stuff. Whereas if I just said, I've got a table in my lounge, right, you go, well, yeah, of course you have. Right. So intuitively, this is how we run our lives. Right. Like practically, that's how we go about our lives of believing and not believing things. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So the Exodus account is not just packed full of extraordinary claims. It is just extraordinary. The whole story is just full of nuts things.
But like, you're forgetting a very important caveat. And I've got to put my deep voice. With God, everything is possible.
So this brings me on to the third part. So I'm really glad you said. So extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So in order to bottom that one out, we can do a kind of Bayesian probability analysis of this. But basically, if we've got something that is before we look at the data, is highly improbable just from form. Like, how often have we seen this stuff before? How often do we believe this in other contexts? We haven't. Okay, so this is really, really improbable, as really implausible as a claim. So in order to get over that implausibility, we need to provide a shed load of evidence. So the question is the Exodus account a shed load of evidence? Is it extraordinarily good evidence? Is the Bible, because remember, we've only got the Bible because it's not confirmed anywhere else. So these are extraordinary claims, only evidence within the Bible, within the Torah. So does the Torah constitute extraordinary evidence? So that's the next major point of that. And then, sorry, Aaron, not allowing you to speak at the moment. You can take over big time afterwards. The third point is what you were just saying, which is this idea that, hey, but we've got a background belief that God exists. This is so important, right? There's a circularity to belief. That for theists, that is a major problem, and this is how it sets out. This is what it looks like. 1, I believe in a world where miracles are possible, right? 2, because I believe in a world in which miracles happened in the Bible. 3, because I have analysed the accounts of the Bible and found them to be a plausible account of the data. Because 4, I believe in a world where miracles are possible. So in other words, you only believe miracles are possible because you've seen them in the Bible, right? And that's what informs your belief that miracles are possible. But you believe those miracles are possible in the Bible because you already believe that miracles are possible. And it's entirely circular, right? So it's so difficult to get out of that. So if part of your background knowledge is that, hey, it's okay, God can do crazy things and anything's possible, and I believe in miracles, you're already deriving that from the Bible and then applying it to analyze the Bible. Do you get what I'm saying? So your answer to these plagues and these miracles are totally fine, like, because I believe that God can do this crazy stuff. You only believe God can do that crazy stuff because of those claims themselves. You're using the belief in those claims to analyze the plausibility of those claims.
The claim has become the evidence for the claim. Yeah, the claim
Exactly.
itself is the evidence, which is weird. I'm going to talk about miracles for a bit, and Aaron is going to help me here. I don't have a logical problem with miracles. If there, the knobs of physics, the constants, the amount of gravity, the mass of the electron, or everything that constitutes why we are here today. People call it fine tuning. So if there is a God who can play with the dials and the knobs, like Richard Dawkins called it, and to make a recipe, then that recipe yields life. Obviously, he can do things like in the Matrix. If the guys in the robots in the Matrix were able to orchestrate life and make people fly or do whatever they want to do by encoding the program in a certain way, I'm sure God can do so. And that's the belief. Obviously, God can explain miracles away, can explain infinite regress. Have we invented a word that sums up the biggest logical fallacy ever practiced and invented by man? Argument from ignorance. I don't know how the fuck this happened, therefore God.
Other than calling it an argument from ignorance or just an argument from lazy intuition, I don't know what else I could call that. And I say lazy intuition just because when you find out, hey, your intuition that every single time you think there is the cause to some sort of thing is something personal, something active, and then you discover, hey, that's not how most things happen in the natural world, and you haven't changed your default, then that's why I say lazy intuition. It's an intuition that has not been updated from the last 500 years of the scientific revolution.
But it's not also what's really important to remember here is that if you are a miracle believing Christian or Jew, you should still require there to be extraordinary evidence to support extraordinary claims, right? It's not like you don't, just because you're a Christian, you don't go through your daily life just believing anything, right? You have a very particular application of your skepticism, I guess. But what we are trying to set out in this book is that even if you are a miracle believing Christian, given the lack of evidence and given the contradictions and given all the philosophical issues that this text brings about or shows, actually you are still not justified in believing it because it doesn't meet the threshold of justified belief. That's really important. So actually, you can question how you can be a miracle believing Christian or Jew if you don't believe this, but I think that everyone should be able to go through the process that we've gone through in this book and come to the conclusion that you're just not justified in believing it. This is clearly myth.
Yeah. I cover, in the Islamic tradition, Muhammad's supposed to have split the moon, right? And half of the moon was on the top of the mountain, the other half was on the bottom of the mountain. Do you know how many people witnessed that particular miracle? Two. The rest were asleep.
How lucky.
How convenient. How convenient. The funny thing about this story is and now we can talk about it seriously, and we can invoke science and say, okay, this is something that we can actually test, right? This is something that God actually interfered in the physical world. and therefore should have been witnessed by. First of all, I'm questioning the wisdom of God, because it seems that he was interfering on daily basis and magnificently when the world's population were around 100 million, right? And doing great stuff, people walking on water and splitting seas and splitting moons. And as soon as video cameras and camcorders evolved, suddenly, literally in the Islamic world, he appears inside a watermelon. His name is written inside a watermelon or an egg. It seems like he's been weakened by the strong nuclear force or something.
Such a good point.
Something weird is going on. Yeah. So
as soon as our ability to record things much more better emerges, then we suddenly don't see mass miracle claims. I mean, the sorts of things that happened in the Exodus accounts are just phenomenal, and we've not seen anything like that in now thousands of years, really, and that should lead us to go, is that what we'd expect if it was more mythological rather than historical? And because people are born and brought up, like, I'm going to return to that idea, if you're born and brought up in the bubble of Judeo-Christianity, then you're like, yeah, but that definitely happened. And yeah, I'm going to look at the moon being split in two in Islam and say that's absolute nonsense, abject rubbish. But my miracles are true. And it's just, there are all sorts of double standards.
And a question for Aaron here. And God's intervention sort of, it's stopped at around when the population close to 500 million, and that's it. And maybe today, like 8 billion and counting, you would think God's intervention would actually make more sense. The other thing is with the argument, the gaps of the gods. They were in the hundreds of God of the gap, hundreds of thousands of them back in the day. They've been answered away. All these gods sort of reside in mythology and museums, which is the right place for gods. Do you think the Abrahamic God? I mean, this is a speculative jump here, and we've got to go back, of course. Do you think at some point Yahweh, and I think there is a statue for Yahweh. You aware of that? There is a statue of Yahweh?
I know of some coins from Judah that depict a god riding in the sky that looks like Zeus, but might be interpretable as Yahweh. But beyond that, I'm not sure. And according to other later sources, when the General Pompey barged into the Holy of Holies when he took over Judea, he wanted to go in there and see what all the fuss was about, and discovered, hey, there's nothing in here. There's no statue to the deity. It's empty space. And there were other Egyptian allegations that Yahweh was actually a donkey-headed god. So there's lots of
I think there are only figurines that have been claimed might be Yahweh, but I don't think there's any existent.
Yeah, but there are some older drawings. In particular, there's one that's like left on some ostraca, and it's a picture.
Ostraca means pottery, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a picture of Yahweh and a female goddess, and we actually have writing above it, and it says Yahweh and his Asherah, basically his
wife,
his side
consort,
piece, I guess you could
concubine, or whatever. Consort. Yeah, is the right word.
If you look at that drawing as well, you will also notice Yahweh is packing in the male department. You could actually see his exposed regions and realize, yep, that's a guy.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Was he endowed like today's world, or back in the Greek philosophers where they used to make the penis smaller than usual just to make sure that they're more intellectual?
That is a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to quickly go down it very quickly. In Francesca Stavropoulou's book, God and Anatomy, she points out that there's some argument that God's member could fill the entire temple. So at least in that depiction and that reading, he's packing. In that drawing, it's not small, but it's not temple sized.
Yeah. Well,
what a conversation.
Sorry, we're just kicking around.
Hey, but actually, on the point of miracles and whether we should believe them or not, etc., etc. There was a move. It's kind of went out of popularity a couple of hundred years ago, but is somewhat back in vogue. Some people adhere to it. The movement of rationalism, where the rationalists would try and explain away these miracles through naturalistic means. And actually, Aaron has a little section on that in the book. I don't know if that's worth a mention.
Well, it's also probably worth mentioning that I kind of have a history dealing with that. I mean, there was this other book I wrote. Just, it might come to my mind later about what book I wrote about these naturalistic explanations for things. It might come to me later.
Star Bethlehem, a critical view. You need to buy it.
By the way, folks, just a quick one in the description. Whoever's watching, Johanthan and Aaron's full contact details, website, YouTube channels are in the description of the video. If you're curious about the two brilliant minds that I've got with me at the moment, please check them out. We're gonna probably allude to their work and progress later on. By the way, the name of the book you're writing right now about Moses, do you have a title yet? Or
the Exodus: A Critical Examination of the Moses Story.
All right, is it anchored, set in stone?
Yeah. Well, it's mainly written. There'll be some additions that will need to go in, and I'm just working through editing with Aaron at the moment. But that will require quite a lot of work.
Because some publishers will tell you we need to make that a little bit sexier. We need to grab the attention.
Well, it just fits in. Yeah, I know it fits in with the other two, which is the Nativity: A Critical Examination and Resurrection: A Critical Examination. So it's like the trilogy of the same titles.
Because Hitchens had to have a subtitle to his book. Religions poisons everything, and the publisher said, "Oh, that's sexy. That is going to sell."
It might be like the Exodus, Moses is bollocks, or something like that. No.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to be offensive.
That's funny. That will sell. Go for it, Aaron.
Connected to miracle stories. So there are attempts to try to explain some of the Exodus miracles as completely naturalistic things. One of the things I do dive into in the book is the attempts to explain the parting of the Red Sea is, it just got really windy, and because of the set down from that wind, you could just basically walk across a sandbar. And the math that they try to use for that, I realize, this should require hurricane force winds that have never been seen in the Red Sea, lasting for 12 hours and stopping the minute the last Israelite cross, just in time for the Egyptian army to be destroyed. So it's a whole bunch of nonsense in terms of the exact timing, but also it doesn't fit the description anyways, because all that will do is push the water to one side. But the Bible says specifically the waters were split into two walls on the left and right side of the people walking down in columns. So it's I'm sorry, but Cecil B. DeMille did a better job in the biblical studies there than these other science folks trying to explain this miracle away. One other thing when it comes to miracles, we definitely want to have extraordinary evidence. And if the Egyptians themselves told us about these miracles, that might at least be considered extraordinary. But what's extraordinary to me is not only did the Egyptians not notice, after the alleged time of the Exodus, the Egyptians were still in control of the Holy Land. And we can tell that from archaeology and from their own writings, that basically not only did they not notice millions of slaves fleeing there, but the land they fled to was still their own territory.
Was still under control. That was going to be my point, because we know that not just the peninsula of Sinai, even the area where they went to, up to modern Palestine and that point, that area, that entire area was still under the Egyptian control. So
it's even worse than that, actually, because when you look at the accounts in Exodus of the 10 plagues, right? The reason God does that is because he literally says it in, I'll find a quote, but he's basically saying, I'm doing this to show you my power and to, I am the head honcho here. And the idea, and he talks as well about, this being his legacy. I'll find a quote in a second, but the idea is that you would expect, if you were the Egyptians and you just had your crops and your cattle and your firstborn decimated and your army decimated and your pharaoh told what for by this actual God, right, who is saying, I'm the one God, I'm really powerful, check me out, kind of that. I mean, there's a bit of inference going on there as being the one God. We can talk about, anyway, henotheism and maybe there being several gods, but the idea is that he is showing he is the head God. And what you would expect is that the Egyptian people would go, oh my goodness, we've just been absolutely trashed by Yahweh. We better start believing in Yahweh and praying to Yahweh and doing whatever Yahweh asks us. But what happens is the Israelites, as we'll call them, leave Egypt and go wherever they go, and then the Egyptians forget entirely about the existence of Yahweh for about 1,000 years. Well, like the next time we hear about Judaism or like anything to do with Judaism appears in the Elephantine Papyri in sort of 4 to 500 BCE, and then we get some waves of Jewish immigration maybe in the 300s around that time, and then we start hearing about Judaism, but that's from Jewish people coming back into Egypt. There's literally no evidence. So how could you have this extraordinary expression and exhibition of power and the country brought to its knees? Like it says very explicitly, every single firstborn, every single, like right across the nation of Egypt is decimated, and then everyone goes, just after the Israelites leave, it's like, oh, yeah, brilliant. That's well, I'm glad that's over.
What's on the telly?
yeah. Just, well, anyway, back to a bit of Seth and Osiris, and like, but none of it makes any sense.
This particular reaction gets repeated everywhere. The Jesus situation with somebody cut somebody's ear. Was it whose ear's been cut? Is it Peter?
Yeah. Peter pulled out a sword, cut off the ear of one of the soldiers, and then Jesus is like, "Dude, don't do that," and puts the ear back in place.
Yeah, and nobody at this point is like, "Fuck, that's divine. That's gonna be something."
Same with the gods, Matthew's gods at the tomb. It's like, just seen Jesus resurrected, and you go, "Okay, here's some shekels. Go away. Don't tell anyone about it." Like, okay, fair enough. Yeah, thanks for that. And you're like, none of this makes any sense. Like, it's not how humans would react. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before the Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so that they may serve me. For this time I am going to send all my plagues to you and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For had I now put out my hand and struck you and your people with plague, you would then have been eliminated from the earth. But indeed, for this reason, I have allowed you to remain in order to show you my power and in order to proclaim my name throughout the earth. So they should be proclaiming his name throughout the earth. Right? Still, you exalt yourself against my people by not letting them go. And of course, we can also talk about how he hardened Pharaoh's hearts so that he didn't let them go. And then God punished, the whole thing is just...
Yeah, he hardened his heart, but then one of the punishments was to kill the firstborn of Egypt.
And to kill the cattle, and then give the cattle he's already killed boils, and then to kill all the cattle again. Like, that's the plagues. It's like, none of this makes any sense.
Strange.
And of course, to kill the camels that did not exist in Egypt at that time because they had not yet been domesticated.
Correct.
Which is how the Joseph story had them coming on camels and blah blah blah, and you're like, they did. Which if you're writing these, this is the reason why camels is really important. Sorry, Aaron. The reason why camels is really important is because, like, we're trying to work out whether this story is true, right? And as claimed in the Exodus, in the book of Exodus. But if the alternative hypothesis is that this was written later in, I don't know, the exilic or post-exilic period, then, what data supports either hypothesis? When you have in the story people going on camels around this area where camels didn't exist for another 1,000 years, and one of your hypotheses is the story is written 1,000 years later, then that makes a lot of sense, like to anachronistically include camels in the story if you're writing it at a time when camels were kicking around that area. But at the time that you are predating it, they didn't exist. And same with pitch on the basket used in the birth story. So this is all part of the jigsaw.
And I guess this becomes very, very when you have a piece of fossil, it's kind of easy. It's a lot easier. You use a style of dating that would suit the age of the fossil. It's not carbon dating's got a certain limit anyway, as we all know. So you got sort of like a atomic decay type of method, and we measure. However, with writings, it's a little bit it's actually quite difficult. It's very difficult. But one of the things you would do is what languages have been used, and has it used words that didn't exist at the time? And that is so important to date a text. And Aaron, you were having a thought here.
Yeah, so I'm going to complete the thing about text when it comes to camels, and then talk about another text in Egyptian, because interesting thing, there is actually no indigenous word for camel in Egyptian. There's no hieroglyph for camel, and we don't actually have any mentions of camels in Egyptian writing until the Coptic writing system, and it's an import from Arabic, ultimately. So it's a pretty strong bit of evidence, not just the archaeological, but even the textual, that the Egyptians didn't talk about these beasts of burden, because they weren't beasts of burden until much, 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 much later.
Yeah.
But other writings we do have, it's interesting because, Johanthan, the quote you had mentioned where basically the Egyptians are supposed to know the power of God and proclaim his name, we do actually have Egyptian sources that mentioned Yahweh, but not as a god, but as a region related to a nomadic group known as the Shasu people. And this is both before and after the time of the Exodus, that the name Yahweh, or Yahweh in the Egyptian writing, is associated with this Shasu region, or this Shasu people, and not with the god that just wrecked their whole town. So it's like they not only did not know this name was associated with a god, they apparently didn't even know this god existed. He is literally the god who wasn't there until much, much later. We don't actually have evidence that Yahweh was actually the name of a deity confirmed until roughly the 9th century BC. So God, in that sense, doesn't exist for sure until then.
I would say this is just prima facie disconfirmatory. Like, I really, like, you don't even need to go any further. Like, for me, this is enough to put the nails in the coffin that you need in terms of burying the belief. But we obviously go much further and talk in minute detail about all of these other aspects. And by the way, just going back to writing down, as you were kind of talking about, Henny, like, one must always be very wary of books that include speech, right? When you tell me a historian that wrote speech and tell me, that I think Herodotus Thucydides talked about this, about how he said, I think something along, I'm paraphrasing, he said, this is what I think they say. It's kind of like what I imagine they would have said at the time. So even he admitted that, like, writing down speech is a bit of a historical problem, but he tried to kind of approximate what would have been said, and by his own admission. But when you've got the Old and New Testaments, including all the speech, like, look at all of the speeches in the Bible, right? Write down every single bit of speech in the Bible on lots of pieces of A4, and then realize the sheer volume of what was claimed to have been said, and then tell me, how did they know that was said when that was written 700 years after the events, or when that was written 40 years or 30 years? Who was walking around with a tablet chipping away saying, oh, can you repeat that, Jesus? Hang on, mate, I didn't quite catch that. Can you say that again? That's not, they didn't have dictaphones. This is a problem.
Indeed, it is a problem. Miracles is quite an interesting situation, because a lot of people think, miracles is evidence for God, and you might get the very strange sort of new age direction of spiritualism linked to God and things like that, and signs of miracles could be quite persuasive for a lot of people. Back on the moon situation, where the alleged moon splitting has occurred, there was a supernova is an explosion of a gigantic star of certain, not every single star will have a supernova. Our sun is not going to have a supernova. But there was one recorded around 1100 years ago by the Chinese, because it's an event that was so magnificent. Obviously, correct me if Aaron, it's about 2 to 3 weeks the sky would be sort of quite lit and
Oh, it depends on a
awesome?
lot of factors. It depends on the kind of supernova, how close it was to us. But yeah, the one that you're referring to, that was both in Chinese annals as well as even in some Native American pictographs, and I think also maybe amongst the Australian Aboriginals, but I'm not sure about that. But nonetheless, it's recorded
It's
in
recorded.
such sources. And yeah, I think that one was visible for at least several days, if not weeks. And I think at its brightest, you could have probably read at night by it if you had a newspaper back then.
Yeah, yeah.
I
So this
love
is
the
the
fact that you've just mentioned something that's right in Aaron's wheelhouse there. I could almost feel the excitement of through the screen
yeah.
of him talking
Well,
about
I,
that.
I love it too because you see that's a natural thing. They're kind of rare, but because we have lots of stars that do happen every now and then, and when they get witnessed, they're magnificent. But we've got a situation here that is linked to the natural world. We know why they happen. We know that they are responsible for having planets and galaxies because all the heavy material in the periodic table is because of that sort of event. Otherwise, we would live just a gassy sort of realm. The It's been recorded. The splitting of the moon, this would have been such a magnificent occasion. This is a view to behold. And two people have only witnesses, which has actually questioned the sanity and wisdom of God, because it's a huge effort just for two people to witness the whole thing. Being an omniscient makes no sense whatsoever, because you would think he would guarantee trying to have a bit of a crowd watching this, but
Well,
no other nation recording it.
Well, there is a. I mean, we talk about this in our book quite a bit, which is, some of the decisions God makes are kind of bizarre in terms of like, how you do your revelation, and uh, I just, it, yeah, I was going to go off on one there, but when you talk about what is God's intention here in terms of what he sets out to achieve by reality, by his revelation. If is the Bible the best revelation he can possibly think of to get the most people believe it. I mean, we're always questioning, we should always be questioning, why would God do it like that? Surely as why not put a cross on the moon, that type thing? Well, he wants some kind of progressive revelation. What? So we want some people to believe but not others, and and we can look at the plagues and say, hang on, you just gave all these plagues to the people of Egypt for punishing Pharaoh for saying no, but you hardened his heart so that he said no. So either you didn't know whether he was going to say yes or no, so you didn't know, which means that you don't have divine foreknowledge, or you knew he was going to say yes and you hardened his heart so that he said no. Either way, I mean, you are massively implicated in the moral culpability for all of these horrific plagues, and they were horrific. But so the question is, why didn't you just soften his heart? And this is a really important question. It's like some people, it doesn't like occur to many people. Like, yeah, just completely switch it around. It's like, well, if you are an all-loving God that so many people claim that you are, then why didn't you soften Pharaoh's heart so that he said yes, everyone lives in harmony, and then you derive some kind of situation where everyone lives in harmony. You don't need to go around killing like children and fetuses and cattle and.
Or if he's lost case, kill him. Okay, one individual, done, finished. Why the firstborn of Egypt? I mean, I never. I mean, this could be a chapter, the morality of God, because
so it is a chapter in the book. So we look, we look at the plagues as being like thoroughly problematic, not only from an evidential point of view, but from a moral point of view, and look at the decision making of God from a moral point of view, and then talk about the problem of evil, which is, why is there all this suffering if God is all loving and all knowing and all powerful? So yeah, we do go to town on this.
Oh, there you go, brilliant. Because maybe let's have a bit of a look at Moses' encounter with God. Because that's the burning bush. It's one of Hitchens' favorite themes in his debates. It's a very interesting entry of God. This is the first time they used to call him other names, Al Shaddai, Adonai, all these names, and this is the first time he reveals his personal name. We don't know how it's pronounced because we don't have vowels. It's constants. So it could be anything. Um, it's not Yahoo. it's a registered name. So we don't. But that entry was quite eccentric, to say the least. A burning bush. Why is that?
I need to actually read. There's, I think, a recent paper by Gad Bernea, who does a lot of ancient Near Eastern Jewish studies and especially Zoroastrianism. And I think he's suggesting that there might be a significant Zoroastrian influence
Ah,
here, in particular, fire temples in Zoroastrianism
ah,
and co-opting some of that
makes
imagery
sense.
for God as this burning bush. I need to see how strong his case is. Just in general, when I've encountered him stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, this is someone to read. This is someone to pay attention to.
Interesting.
But
The fire element. Okay,
yeah,
that makes
but I have not
interesting.
explored that in depth enough to say that he's got it right. But just I remember him talking about that in other interviews, and I'm just like, I need to read that paper when it's available.
Always struck me as a question for you both. I would like your logical uh, justification of this. If God appears to people, even in the Quran, they'll die. The presence of God would kill people. Mountains collapse in front of God. And I never understood that Muhammad, when he got his revelation from Gabriel, he was scared to death. Why does every single time God or one of his angel appears, instead of peacefulness, instead of being content, and you know, it's a situation of horror and terror, and it looks like God cannot control his appearance to people. Couldn't God appearance to people instead of killing them? He could have made it that it's more of a peaceful feeling. Or is it linked to God, and God cannot change that nature about him?
That is complicated to answer in part because how God is conceptualized and described in the narratives changes from author to author to author. So in Genesis, um, basically Abraham and Sarah have God and a couple angels as dinner guests. You know, obviously they're not being burned up because of that, and they're just having a dinner party with the creator of the universe hanging around. But it also gets complicated because later editors come in, and every time you see God, they add in the Hebrew word for angel to say, oh, this is the angel of God rather than God himself. And so you kind of have to kind of read behind the text a little bit to understand what's going on, or see where they didn't do a nice global editing. So they say the angel of God here, but then they say God elsewhere. It's like, come on, finish the job, editor, please. I'm telling Jonathan the same thing as he goes through what I'm writing, and he's just pulling his hair out, looking at my terrible writing. But besides that,
I've got none left.
yeah. So I mean, it gets complicated there, but it kind of falls into a longer set of tropes that you see, for example, in Greek and Roman myth as well, that gods are these shiny, amazing, powerful beings, and when you're in the presence of them, your life is in danger because of what they could possibly do to you. But it's really occasional because sometimes they can disguise themselves just fine. Sometimes they don't even have to disguise themselves, and it's just totally normal. There's an unfortunate um, Sumerian myth of Inanna where she decides to take a nap under a tree. A farmer sees her, is so enthralled by seeing this big, beautiful naked goddess, decides to have his way with her while she's asleep. So obviously he doesn't die from that, but also realizes, oh, I just did that to a very, very potentially angry goddess, and so flees for the city and tries to hide as long as he possibly can from the SA he just did to a deity.
Yeah.
Eventually she does find him and does terrible things, but obviously he was in her presence, to put it very mildly, without being burned up.
I
What I
mean,
was
you've
alluding
got. Sorry, I was just going to say you've got to understand that the Old Testament God Yahweh is very different to the New Testament God,
Mm,
just in so very many ways. And I think when you get these kind of tribalistic contexts, you need to understand Yahweh in the context of the ancient Near East, in the context of all of these kind of cultures and histories that we're learning of the times and places. But the problem is the modern Christian, for example, who would take on the Old Testament, they will apply their modern kind of philosophical God understanding, the all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, and then they have to retroject that onto the Old Testament, and it doesn't quite fit. Like those two, I mean, we talked about this before, I think, Hanny, in a previous video, but those two notions of God are completely separate. And I don't think, I mean, here's attention. It's why so often, even when like William Lane Craig's being challenged in debate and people bring up the Old Testament, he doesn't quite know what to do with arguing about the Old Testament. So he just like holds up Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster, and says, go and read Paul Copan, and then just kind of deflects away from having to, because it's really freaking difficult to
reconcile the two gods. Yeah,
absolutely. And here's just an example, which is a Moses example of how nuts A, the stories are, and B, like, well, not nuts, but how unlike the modern philosophical God Yahweh is. So, but it came, this is Exodus 4:24, but it came onwards, but it came about at the overnight encampment on the way that the Lord met Moses and sought to put him to death. So God is going to put Moses to death. So Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses's feet. And she said, you are indeed a groom of blood to me. So he left him alone. So God left Moses alone. At the time, she said, you are a groom of blood because of the circumcision. So in other words, God is just about to kill Moses. Like literally, that's what the story says. He's about to kill Moses. So his wife cuts off their son's foreskin, throws it at Moses's feet. I mean, there are different translations. It could be touching his forehead. The hymn is a little bit unsure. But anyway, let's assume that it cuts off the son's foreskin, throws it at Moses's feet. And God goes, oh, do you know what? I'm going to change my mind. I was just about to kill Moses, but now you've cut off a piece of your child's penis. I'm not going to kill Moses. And then that's that. And you're like, and then everyone, the modern Christian and the modern Jew is like, yeah, God is love, God is amazing, all this. Like, do you read the nuts things that are in your Bible? And what is going on? And of course, they come up with all highfalutin ways to explain this, but that should be understood in the context of this kind of tribalistic set up, and
it's almost like
a modern God,
something from a horror movie with a psycho killer who's about to kill you, and then something random happens and they go, oh, I'm entertained, I've changed my mind. It's weird.
You've got a small child without their consent and you've cut off a bit of their genitalia and you've thrown it at the father's feet. That's what I'm talking about.
What I was alluding to is something, but it's probably a lot deeper than the story of Moses and story of Yahweh, is God's free will, if God has a free will. Because what I was trying to say is...
Oh, this is my warehouse.
Yeah. if God is acting according to nature, there you go. And that nature, so God appearing to people would kill people. And God can't help it because it's linked to his nature. The fine-tuning, the knobs, the dials we talked about, it seems that there is a recipe to follow, and then when it gets followed, you have a cake, you have a universe. It's supposed to be that God can make a cake out of cucumber if you wanted to, but no, he's controlled by certain protocols. The a priori, can God create a rock too heavy that he cannot lift? Looks like these things are superior to God's existence himself, because he has to work within that particular realm. So you guys do it. What do you reckon?
This is a sidebar, and this is nothing to do with Moses, but let me just indulge myself. Sorry, Aaron. But God has absolutely no free will for two reasons. One, if you believe God has divine foreknowledge. So if he knows every future event, then he knows all his own future events, as in his own interactions into humanity. And he cannot therefore act against his own predictions, because otherwise it makes his foreknowledge infallible. So in order for God's foreknowledge to be perfect and infallible, he has to know everything that's going to take place, and he cannot do anything other than what would be already known by him in his foreknowledge. So that's already puts him on a track. Then you've got his nature. So he's all loving, right? And unless there are things that he could do that are identical in the moral outcomes, or however you're going to evaluate any given action or decision, then he has to do what is maximally loving and within the remit of his omniscience, omnibenevolence, and omnipotence, right? And so already there, he's having to like if he said, "Oh, it's Tuesday morning, I'm a bit tired, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be a bit of a bastard." It's like you can't do that because you're all loving. Like you have to do and then you start drawing, further conclusions. Well, then if everything he does has to be maximally loving, then this is the maximally loving reality, and there can be no more perfection than this, either as it is or what it's working towards. And so this brings about all sorts of issues philosophically, and those are the stuff that I've talked about with you previously, and they are found in my book that you should all go and buy, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan and Divine Design. Anyway, that's a sidebar.
Aaron, your piece.
Well, I think, though, there is some confusion because we are confusing Yahweh with the one true God, that is Godzilla.
So let's then get back to Moses, which is probably what we should do. And Aaron, do you want to just give us an idea of, I don't know whether it's worth, as we, I guess at some point meander towards some kind of vague conclusion, whether we talk about the general tropes in Moses's life that are mythic, the birth story, his name, and also we've kind of hinted at extra biblical evidence of Moses from, say, Manetho and Hecataeus. What do you think is where should we go next?
I just want to say that we've been talking for an hour and 15. How about we go for another half an hour? Because I don't think this is going to be last of this conversation today. We're just talking about the whole book in general, but I think we will have other conversations where we maybe chapter by chapter we will actually delve deep.
I do have a hard stop at the top of the hour.
Yeah. So, and I want to leave the last 15 minutes just for people if they have questions and stuff like that.
So I can hop down the mythic trope of Moses' life, and especially I'll focus on the birth story because it touches a whole lot of interesting things. So, once upon a time, there's a baby. He's called Moses. But how did he get his name? Because of how he was miraculously saved for being tossed in the Nile River. Now, instead of being eaten by crocodiles, as probably would have been more likely to happen, or hippopotamus, or hippopotami, if that's the plural of hippopotamus. That's what you would expect to happen in such a case, but instead, he floats down the Nile River in a basket, is discovered by an Egyptian princess, takes him out and gives him the name Moses because he's drawn out of the water. First off, we have massive trope alert here because I can give you 3 different stories where the same thing happens to a special little baby. And I'll go in opposite order of time and when we have them. If you are a fan of Chinese fantasy novels, Journey to the West, the main monk there, Tang Sung, he is placed on a raft as a baby to escape attempts to kill him, and he is raised by foreign parents elsewhere to then become a holy man and eventually achieve his mission. If we go back to Roman times, you have the twins Romulus and Remus. They are set adrift down the Tiber River and are brought up by a foster family and then eventually go and achieve their destiny of finding the city of Rome. And if we go further back in time, we get Sargon of Akkad, a legendary Akkadian king, and according to his biography, and notice the scare quotes I'm using, his biography, he says that he was also thrown into a basket covered in pitch, floated down the river, pulled out, and raised by foster parents, and then eventually went and ran his kingdom. So when Moses comes along as Johnny-come-lately in a basket covered in pitch, floating down the river, taken in by foster parents, and eventually achieves his destiny, we have to say, I've read this story before. This motif is both new and old. It's reused. Everyone knows it. Everyone recognizes it as myth, except somehow when it ends up with the story of Moses, and we're happy to say, oh, that story about the monk who is saved and then is protected by a 500-year-old magical monkey. Oh, that's complete fiction. Oh, this Sargon of Akkad, it's just royal propaganda. But when it's the Bible, oh no, gospel truth.
And Aaron, we've got a modern story. I don't know, you guys. Do you know a guy by the name of Kal-El? But instead of being, he's been sent from a spaceship, and also known as Superman.
And Jewish.
Yes.
There you go.
The creators of Superman were both Jewish, and Kal-El, I mean, he literally has God in his name.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very clever. Very
So
clever.
the motif, so their story often involves a birth with an element of miracle or mystery. They embark on a form of quest whereby they gain new knowledge, a difficult task or journey that must be undertaken to achieve a goal or earn a reward. This will entail a path filled with the challenges and adventures, perhaps involving magical and the supernatural. They possess special powers. Heroes must use strength, wits, or both to defeat enemies, although some are aided by luck and or by their protective deity or magician. In the end, the hero returns home enriched with powers or wisdom. These are the tropes, and you get the birth story, the miraculous birth story, which is ridiculous because, of course, if you're going to save your child's life, you don't put them in a tiny basket and throw them into a river full of crocodiles. You just don't do it. Like, that's not what you do to try and save a baby. And there's an unnecessary chapter in our book where I delve into whether pitch was indeed anachronistic or not. So this is relevant. Well, there are arguments to be made that pitch is something you'd find around Mesopotamia. The King Sargon of Akkad, they had pitch there to put around the basket, so it makes sense. But if you're going to steal that story and then apply it to Moses, there wasn't actually pitch around Egypt at the time, so that it just doesn't work as a story, and it shows it's been stolen from an earlier position. That makes sense when you have the theory that the story was written in or concocted in the exilic period. So we know that in the 500s, wasn't it, that the Jewish peoples were exiled into Babylonia, and here's a period where they're feeling, right, we aren't in our homeland, or many of them aren't in our homeland, we've lost our national identity, and as a result you concoct a national identity. So the Bible or the Torah becomes kind of our flagship book that sings the praises of our heroes and creates our national identity. And what they're doing is they're taking elements from maybe Greek thought, they're taking elements from Babylonian thought, King Sargon of Akkad, right? We're going to take that story and we're going to apply it to Moses. Pitch basket, yeah, we'll have that. Camels, yeah, we'll have that. Of course, camels didn't exist in Egypt at the time. Pitch didn't exist particularly in Egypt at the time. And so again, this jigsaw puzzle of trying to work out what's going on here. And, the conclusion is this is clearly a myth. And of course, we're just touching on the birth story. Sorry, Aaron, I interrupted.
I'm going to shock people and tell them that camels didn't come even from Arabia or Sahara Desert. They actually come from Canada. No, that's true. From evolution, like these are the ancestors of camels, North America.
Oh, that makes sense because llamas and alpacas are of the same family as
yes,
camels.
of the same. Is correct. Yes.
Yes.
Go for it, Aaron.
All right. So last thing I want to connect, and this actually connects to some of the cutting edge research that has come out of this project, is the name of Moses, because it's a bit weird. According to the narrative, this Egyptian princess takes Moses out of the water and gives him this name because the name Moses or Moshe means to draw out. So first off, why is an Egyptian princess giving this child a Hebrew name?
Yeah.
Which is weird. Two, it's actually the wrong name anyways because they're using the wrong participle. It's Moses that's being taken out of the water, but his name would suggest he's the one drawing out of the water.
Yeah.
Moses didn't pick himself up by his own baby straps.
Yeah, maybe that's the name of things to come.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, what has popped out of our research is trying to explain where his name comes from, and many people have pointed out, hey, this name seems really weird in this context. Is there some sort of Egyptian source of this name? And one common idea is that this comes from a part of other names of pharaohs. So, for example, there are pharaohs named like Mose, Tutmose, and things like that. Basically, like son of or birthed from this god or caused to be birthed by this god. And people think, well, that might have been Moses' name. But my most recent article on this suggests it's actually a much, much later name, which we can find in Demotic and in Coptic. And ultimately, this name exists probably no earlier than roughly 320 BC. And originally, Moses wasn't even Jewish. He was an Egyptian. And that's our oldest sources about Moses. From the Greeks, they said he was an Egyptian guy who led a colonization group out of Egypt to the Holy Land and set things up there. So our earliest mentions of this Moses figure say he's an Egyptian dude who does this stuff. And I've done this linguistic argument that actually suggests the name comes from the Egyptian word Moshe. Sounds a whole lot like Moshe, yes. Because I think that's the ultimate root there. And a bit more evidence that this story is very much a Johnny come lately and an appropriation of this Egyptian folk hero to become the leader of the Jewish people out of Egypt. It's both clever and interesting.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Can I just add a little bit into, and I'm actually going to read a bit here, just because I'm reminding myself of all of this. But like the birth story is more ridiculous than you would think, because what happens is not only does the mother send this baby down the river because she doesn't want it to be within kind of the Israelite scare quotes Israelite context to protect it because it's going to be killed. So she chooses to do the throwing down the river thing and just hopes that someone not Israelite picks it up. But it gets even more unlikely. Not only does this baby in its ark find a caring Egyptian who doesn't mind about a random Hebrew baby, and apparently you could tell it was Hebrew. I don't know, maybe it's circumcised or something. But also this loving person just so happened to be in a royal household. Even better still, it was a daughter of the Pharaoh. This is just insanely fortuitous. Before I get on to talking about Moses' name, let me just discuss how wildly improbable this is. We have a scenario where the mother sends a baby with the basket with the baby down a river. The sister watches it to make sure it is safe. And we can talk about Egyptian appropriation there, but also the sister just so happens to be working as one of the maidens for the Pharaoh's daughter. She then suggests a wet nurse who just so happens to be the actual child's mother. So the mother is reunited almost immediately with the baby she has just cast into the river full of crocodiles. The bafflement continues with Pharaoh's daughter. She presumably knows all Hebrew boys are about to be killed and then finds a recognizably Hebrew infant boy she wants to help. And she sends him to live with a Hebrew wet nurse, his mother, putting him in precisely the perilous situation in which he started. This is strong evidence that the story is tacked on because Pharaoh's daughter seems to be wholly unaware of what her father has decreed for all the Hebrew children. The idea that Pharaoh's daughter bringing up the baby in secrecy, itself a highly unlikely thing, is actually just inference and is not mentioned in the text, which just states that she brought up Moses. It is really as if this beginning to Moses' life was a literary afterthought. Honestly, I can't overstate this. The story is fantasy. It's complete and utter unfiltered and unrealistic fantasy. But that's just me ranting, because just every element of the Moses story is just clearly mythic, and just you are not justified in believing it is historically true.
I'm gonna have to apologize in advance because Egyptians used to circumcise, by the way, so they would have, she would have not known any difference.
Yeah,
and I apologize in advance for my Jewish friends, but Jewish people can take a joke. It must have been his nose.
So we talk about. I don't know. Do we talk about this? I know I wrote an article on this once about the history of circumcision for Jewish people, and there are some theories about it possibly being originally a denotation of slavery. And I don't know. I can't remember if we include it in this book because it's been a few years since I've looked at the text as closely as I'm just about to as I edit it. But I know Hector Avalos wrote an article on this some time back, which might have found its way into the book. But anyway, there you go. It's just a random thinking out loud. Sorry.
The encounter of Moses with God. We talked about the burning bush, sort of, and that first conversation was a fascinating conversation because Moses is asking God. They're having a conversation. They were having a proper conversation to the point where Moses is asking God, okay, well, I'm going to go back to my people. What's your name, dude? Because I want to make sure that when I go back, I can actually tell them your name. So what's your reflection of that, Aaron?
Well, actually, I think this is the best evidence we have for God, and that the true God is Popeye, because he explains his name is I am what I am, which is, as we all know, the catchphrase for Popeye the Sailor Man.
Oh my God!
See what
I've actually had spinach today, so it's interesting.
And if you actually do follow the comics of Popeye, he is all powerful. There are comics where he basically pulls a string and undoes the entire universe. So he is that powerful.
Wow.
The I am who I am is quite an interesting concept because and I'm going to talk about physics because Aaron likes physics. If God exists in the B theory of time, the block time, where present, past, and the future is there's no such thing as tomorrow, or sequence of events, or causality for that matter.
And
Everything
therefore free will.
it shouldn't, like, no, you can't. No, there's that concept wouldn't even mean anything.
No.
Yeah, it wouldn't mean, yeah, because words like before and after and while, and that these words don't exist. It's one block existence, that everything exists simultaneously at the same time.
Yeah.
So if God is in existence of that particular realm, the be, and we are in the illusion era of time because of the breaking of the symmetry at the beginning of the universe at the Big Bang. That's why we feel the era of time, but it doesn't actually exist. It's more of our perception of time. Can God then be? But I've been trying to think about it, but it cannot be an intervening God. The only best God that you can have with this particular theory is the God of Spinoza. That's the best you can have. A non-interfering God who's not even aware of himself. Does that check?
More maybe because I'm not enough of a Spinoza scholar, so if I call him a pantheist, if that's an abuse of his position or not. But if you basically make God consistent with the laws of nature itself, that's perhaps, the best you could do. But the supernaturalist one that just comes in and occasionally puts the universe out of order in whatever way they want, but somehow exists in time and doesn't exist in time, but all of time exists at once, yet it doesn't. Yeah, that God is at best confusing, and in my opinion, incoherent.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah. So with regard to what we haven't talked about today that probably would be worthy of discussion is documentary hypothesis and multiple sources of the Bible, because what we need to do when we are looking at whether the Moses story is true or not is understand the source, because the source text is the only evidence we really have, given that, as we've explained, that there is virtually no reference to Moses, certainly not contemporaneous reference to Moses or Exodus outside of the Bible. So then it's like, is the Bible itself, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, do they constitute extraordinary evidence? And the fact is they don't. They just don't. So we don't know who wrote them. The idea, I don't know, maybe we can finish off by talking about whether Moses wrote the Torah, because that's what many traditional scholars would claim, and that's just clearly not the case. And then it's like, well, who did write them? And then as Aaron's already hinted at, there are multiple sources to the Bible, and there are different theories as to how that all works and pieces together. But essentially, it is just not a very good guide to history. It is a multiply sourced document with unknown provenance to a large degree, that has a whole collection of different genres with different objectives in what they're trying to set out, and the authors are trying to set out. And so to then say, and therefore everything that they say about Moses in the Exodus, in the book of Exodus, is correct, is historically true, is just a leap too far.
Yeah. Do you guys have noticed through your research that there is an evolution of the character of God and the entity of God within the Old Testament? Like, it started in a certain way. Like, I understand that there is no concept of heaven and hell in Judaism. It started.
Or the soul, really.
Or the soul. Yeah, there is no such thing as afterlife. Satan wasn't what we think he is in Christianity. There's a lot of things. Even the God himself, when we first started, a lot of people allude to, are we talking about a pantheon here, and he's the top? The allusion to Elohim and his background, and then monotheism sort of creeps in a bit later. So have you seen elements of change within the story itself?
I would say, in fact, one of the interesting chapters that I had worked on when I was trying to track down the development of the Exodus tradition, I've come to the current conclusion that the Exodus itself isn't even what's in the book of Exodus originally. That the concept of God going down to Egypt and taking his people out, I don't think was even the original tradition, that was a later outgrowth when the Israelites, or the Jewish people, then actually needed an Exodus after they were in exile in Babylon. Before that, it looks like the Exodus tradition wasn't coming out of Egypt, but was just no longer being under the heel of Egyptian power while in the Holy Land. So instead of coming out of Egypt, they were coming out from under Egyptian control.
Rejecting Egypt,
which is actually something we can confirm archaeologically, because in the 12th century, Egyptian power is falling apart, and the region of the Holy Land then actually regains its autonomy from Egyptian power. And it's in this time that we know there was at least a people group called Israel, and it seems to be in this environment that this early tradition grows from, and then changes and evolves over the centuries from tellings as it needed to, with the different needs for the people that were sometimes independent, sometimes conquered, sometimes in exile, and needing salvation from that exile. And when they finally got it with the destruction of the Babylonian Empire, it changing their story. And so, yeah, God goes from he inherits Israel and comes and lifts them up to God is the master and creator of all of creation and will go into Egypt, smack up all of the Egyptian gods, and then take his people out.
You said definitely got lots of hallmarks of a kind of polytheistic setup there, where God just becomes basically the prime God and then takes on elements of competitor gods like Baal, and then those elements get subsumed into Yahweh, and Yahweh becomes this you get more of a henotheistic monolatry, where God is the prime God out of all these other gods, and it's like, you need to believe in my God, or you need to not believe in, because it's kind of like they believed in all the gods, but you need to follow my God. Yahweh is the God. He's the prime God. He's the most awesome God out of all of these gods. And actually, where you'll find elements of the stories of Baal or a storm god being written into Yahweh throughout the Old Testament, so that he just does become this greater God than all the others. Before then, all the other gods are just kind of, they disappear, and you then approach the New Testament, and then you start getting elements of from Greek thought, maybe the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire, an intertestamental period, where you start seeing the development of heaven and hell, because they're like, why do bad things happen to good people? We're the chosen people. Exodus kind of idea that we're the chosen people, this is our land. But why in the Seleucid Empire do we have Hellenized Jews oppress us? Like, that sucks. How can we understand, if we're the chosen people, how bad things happen to us? Then you look at the Greeks, they've got a version of heaven and hell where it all gets sorted out in the afterlife, so we're going to nick that idea, and then you get the development of that. But actually, so this book is all about placing the Exodus story and Moses in the context of the ancient Near East. So, like, all of this is an evolution of ideas. The Old Testament, or the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the Hebrew Bible is in the context of the ancient Near East, where you get an evolution of the ideas of God, an evolution of the theology, an evolution of the law. So a major part of the book is looking at the law codes. Like, the Exodus is the reason Exodus exists as a story, is to deliver law to the people, right? The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, then you got the covenant laws, and the covenant code. This is about delivering the law to the people. Where does that law sit in the context of the ancient Near East? Actually, we can see the evolution of that through all these other legal codes. Hammurabi, Hittite, Ur-Nammu, all these other law codes. But Christians and Jews will look at the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and they will go, this is the story, and this is the law, and it's just its own self-contained unit, and that's to completely extract it from the context in which it should be seen.
Have you guys ever read Terry Pratchett's Small Gods?
I really should read Pratchett. Lots of people advise it of me.
I'm ashamed that I haven't read any Pratchett.
This is very close to what you're saying. That where it's a realm of gods where they diminish, their glow diminishes by number of likes, follows, and shares, like today's world. Honestly, we're talking about social media influencers. Really, your God is as big as its followers, and they actually diminish in size. They become smaller. Even the other one called, they cancelled it, and I loved it. American Gods. Have you seen that?
I've seen the first series of that. Yeah.
I wish they continued that, because it's quite interesting how God sort of dwindled and diminished because people stop believing in them.
a similar thing also in the remake of Clash of the Titans. The power of Zeus and the other gods
Oh yeah,
is
yeah,
dependent on how many worshippers and temples they have. So
yeah.
Zeus loses power as people basically get fed up with the gods and stop worshiping them.
So it's almost like the Matrix, like if God's almost like created humans because he requires energy, and that energy comes from prayers. And if you stop prayers, God sort of is deprived from nutrition.
Well, this is where we get onto more philosophical arguments about, what does God want of humanity? Like the idea of praise and worship is inherently problematic. Like
Yeah,
the fact that you would be a God that has needs is already an issue. Like if you are perfect as an entity, then you are living in ontological perfection. Then you would have no needs. So that you would enjoy the smell of burning flesh, that you would require sacrifice, that you require praise and adulation and worship, is a fundamentally flawed idea given ontological perfection. So yeah.
all right, guys. Within the next 5 minutes, we're going to get into the question
Well, I think
section.
Aaron's going to have to shoot off soon, but
Yeah,
so
yeah,
probably get
yeah.
there now.
Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe we should start now. I think we've covered enough topics to talk about everything generically. Let's agree, in the future to talk about maybe special elements. When is the book going to be released?
Good question. I am so busy at the moment. I'm not doing a very good job of editing, but I'm now back on the wagon. I did a whole load today actually, and I'm looking at speeding that process up. So I don't know. I can't answer that, but it is rather dependent on me not being obsessed with other things in life.
Yeah, because we don't want to completely talk about every single little detail. People have been like, I don't need to read this. I don't,
Yeah,
the whole thing.
good
So
point.
we need to hint at things, so we're, the full shebang is going to be when you read the book. So yeah, it's open for questions, but until we see, I think there was a question that I saw here. Can you read it, guys?
What's the validity of the claim that the story of Moses and the Exodus took place in Yemen and did not originally occur in Palestine? I'm not actually aware of that one.
This is new to me. My best guess is this is related to maybe an explanation for why there is a significant Jewish community in Yemen.
They call them the Yemenites. Yeah, the Yemenites.
Yeah.
I mean, this is in Islam. They have the same thing. They reckon Muhammad and nothing didn't happen in Saudi Arabia, but in Petra, in Jordan, or in Yemen. To me, it's an interesting concept, but it doesn't change much of the situation here, right?
Yeah.
I'd
At the very least,
rather.
the story we have is very clearly they are in Egypt and they are going to a certain land and they're not taking the direct route because of the Philistines being in the way, which also is an anachronism that we can get into later.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. Like on that topic, it's something that I've mentioned Manetho and Hecataeus, but you get these other people who mention Moses or who we don't have the original text, so we know that they mention Moses by seeing a text that refers to them, or even a text that refers to a text that refers to the original. But so we do have mention of versions of Moses stories that might have very little to do with the biblical version. Even Josephus, writing obviously as a Jewish historian much later, has kind of different interpretation of Moses, which is interesting. I think there's a lot of additions in there. Like you could say it's fleshing out. I think it's turning Moses into something that was useful for him, possibly. And so there are different iterations of Moses written. I wouldn't say contemporaneously, because nothing is written at the time frame that you would like it to be written if you're going to have an accurate representation of the real Moses, because that was 700 years plus before what we're talking about. But anyway, I don't know if Aaron has anything more to mention there.
Well, people preparing their. How long are you going to be with us, Aaron? How long you've got? 10 minutes or so? Or?
I was able to actually bump it. The meeting that I had at the top of the hour, I was able to move it. So I have a little
top
more
of the hour.
freedom.
Okay. So we finish in the next, let's say 10 minutes. So we'll give you some time to sort of have a, go to the bathroom and have a drink and, get ready. It's all good.
Yeah. So Aaron, any thoughts on other iterations of Moses?
So there's also one that we only have not even quotes from, but kind of like a half paraphrase that Eusebius says. There's other 2nd century BCE Jewish writer by the name of Artapanus who talks about Moses, where this person also built up basically all the Egyptian civil system and religious system. He led expeditions down to Ethiopia and conquered places, but also has some of the other biblical stories as well. So it's this like weird mishmash of this other Egyptian hero we know about called Sesostris, who does similar sorts of military expeditions. He sounds like Moses without being Moses, but also mixed with the biblical figure. So it's a lot of interesting mishmashes in these other Greek and Latin sources, which kind of suggests he was kind of a folk hero outside of the Bible and then kind of got like stuffed in and then became the canonical version.
Yeah, no. One of the big things we probably don't have time to talk about it now. That I think's fascinating, or maybe we do. Maybe this is a good place to leave it. The Elephantine Papyri, I think, are like one of the single most revealing finds in terms of the whole of our understanding of the Hebrew Bible and Judaism, because the received understanding was that the Torah was starting to be constructed in maybe, I don't know, 800, 900 BCE. And that still that was referring to Moses like 300 years before. But as Aaron has already said, that modern scholarship has moved that much further forward. So now you're talking about the post-exilic period, like, in the 200-300s, right? And so, you have this idea, though, the kind of received wisdom is that, well, Judaism existed, and as we know, Moses had all these laws and strict moral legal codes, and if you didn't adhere to them, X, Y, and Z would happen. And so you just assume that for the 1,000 years before, I don't know, Jesus, maybe more, that there was this kind of homogenous Jewish culture that existed within the framework of these legal codes. And then we get the Elephantine Papyri that are from around 400 to 500 BCE from this outpost on the border, on the river, near the border of Egypt, from a Jewish outpost there. And I don't know, Aaron, do you want to detail what they found, what they tell us? Because they certainly tell us that people weren't practicing a homogenous version of Judaism.
Well, there's just a few things there. So yeah, so at this location, I think it was on the island of Aswan. So this would be like the southern border region of Egypt of that time, and the group of Jews living there probably brought originally as mercenaries, especially by the Persian Empire that was running Egypt at that time. From what we can see from the papyri and ostraca left by the people there, apparently this group of folks had their own temple, which should first off throw up all the red flags, because the Old Testament, it says there's one and only one temple. It's the one in Jerusalem, and that's the only one that you can properly worship Yahweh at. What is a Yahweh temple doing in southern Egypt? That's already a bit weird. And we also know the people there didn't think this was a problem, because the locals, something happened, they got angry and they burned down the temple, and the Jews there wanted to rebuild it, so they reached out to Jerusalem to try to get funding to help rebuild that temple. And that'd be like, okay, for someone to do that, they can't possibly think it's wrong to have a temple there. That's like a 10-year-old going up to a police officer and asking, hey, could you help me buy some vodka? The only way a 10-year-old would do that is if they don't think there's anything wrong with that. And if the police officer was to not immediately cart them off to jail and tell them, no, you're being a bad little boy, but instead having no issue with that necessarily, you think, okay, maybe these laws aren't in practice at that time. We have other records from there that shows that the Jews there were collecting money to have as offerings to their god, Yahweh, as well as several other Semitic named gods, male and female. We also have some writings that suggest in that temple there was a priestess helping conduct curses. So all sorts of things that you would look and say, that's not in the Bible, and you'd be right. And also these people mention nothing about Abraham. They mention nothing about Jacob. They say nothing about Moses. They say nothing about Joshua. It's like they don't know the stories at all, and yet they seem to be in brotherhood with their folks back further north.
So the Elephantine Papyri tell us, like in conclusion, that there wasn't an established kind of Judaism, if you like, at that time, and therefore it's unlikely that there was a Torah, a Hebrew Bible at that time. So then we can start, piecing the jigsaw together to paint a picture that the Hebrew Bible was constructed far, far later, and that at this time, which is like supposedly 800 years after Moses, you have people who are existing in ways that would be an anathema to like Moses and his people at that time. And that was perfectly normal. So, in other words, it looks like the Moses story was constructed much, much later after the Elephantine Papyri, and then retrospectively placed back in time to far, far before that, where there is no evidence of any of that happening. So it's a story that's constructed, thrown back in time. We then look at all the evidence to confirm that. None of it confirms that, and the Elephantine Papyri, I would suggest, disconfirms it, or at least.
Can I make a suggestion, guys? If you haven't done that already, may I suggest that following the tracks of Moses, that you include a chapter on the Islamic tradition of Moses, because Moses occupy and the Hebrews huge amount of the Quran, and we're talking about. He's obviously got some sources, and the sources were the Jewish people at the time who had evolved theology, the Ebionite, and the different types of the Jewish sects at the time, and his understanding of Moses, while to a degree is consistent with the Old Testament, there are a lot of differences too. So you can actually track how the story evolved 600 years later after Christianity, and it's quite interesting because in the Quran, it's about Muhammad is mentioned 4 times in the Quran, Moses like hundreds of times. The story of Israel and the people of Israel is very prominent in the Quran, and it's quite interesting to see the evolution of that.
Yeah, I just find the Elephantine Papyri in Austria, these shards of pottery and other findings and other letters just absolutely fascinating, and give us a real insight into the idea that actually the Bible the Hebrew Bible was not an established thing for most of the time that we think it was. But yeah,
and I think the story is the same with the Quran. The story is the same with the New Testament. It seems to be a story that keeps repeating itself.
My understanding as well that the Quran also seems to preserve some Zoroastrian lore as well. So it's an interesting collection of religious literature of many a variety, and turned into a new kind of suit, or not sure what the best clothing option would be to describe what Islam becomes with this collection of theologies.
I'm having a conversation in a couple of weeks' time with, I'm not going to say the Arabic Bart Ehrman, because he's more of a Robert Price. He's got a mythicist sort of views on Islam. So we're actually going to look at the oldest manuscript of the Quran, which is called the Sana manuscripts. And we're going to look at the writing and the type of writing at the time, or whether it belongs and does it actually match the current day Quran, which is quite interesting. So lots of people are going to be shocked by the findings of this. Guys, it's wonderful having you again. I can talk to you for hours, but I know Aaron's got a commitment. Johanthan, we are going to have another conversation about this. We don't want to give people way too much, but we might just touch on the outside subjects. And do you want to have any last words, Johanthan and Aaron?
I want to definitely spam the readership with further great products. This is a book that Aaron and I wrote recently, and more people need to read it. Have we talked about this book with you? I think we have, haven't we?
Is this the space one? Yeah.
Aliens and Religion, Where Two Worlds Collide, assessing the impact of discovering extraterrestrial intelligence on religion and theology. So please go and check that book out. That's a fascinating book that looks at the idea of, if extraterrestrial life does exist out there, what impact would that have on religion and theology in our established religion. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanthan. Aaron, do you have anything to say?
First off, I want to say that it's always been a pleasure working with Johanthan on these book projects. They have been an excellent opportunity for both of us to learn things, and also for him to make me better at communicating these things, because every time I look at my writing, I realize how rubbish it is, and Johanthan is willing to suffer through it with me and help it come out far better than it could have otherwise.
Mate, I'm editing. I'm editing this, and like some of my writing as well. Not as well. Some of my writing is leaves a lot to be desired. So it's really great to go through this and then put it all in place. And it's so lovely to write with someone else and to bounce ideas off each other.
As a neutral observer, I can tell you complement each other perfectly. I can see Aaron's a very few words, a very scientific mind. It's equations. Half an inch will tell you the story of how matter and energy are, one and the same thing.
Which
but that's
is the best
the
selling
language
point
of
for our
science.
Aliens and Religion book, because it is the only theology book that I know of that actually gets to theological conclusions using differential equation solutions.
Oh, that's brilliant! I love
That's
that.
how cool we are. That's how cool we are.
And Johanthan, you compliment that because you not with bread only can men live. You add the pizzazz and the words, and so I think it's such a wonderful combination of these two together, philosophy and science, are not in conflict as people might want you to think. So I really, really appreciate all your work, the humor, because you take things not too seriously, which is I love. Life is to be lived as well. So that's wonderful that you're writing very important things while having a laugh. That's brilliant.
Well, I mean, this book is hopefully it is for the intelligent layperson, and it is not like massively. I mean, it is about archaeology and theology and stuff. So there is, if you're interested in that, it takes a certain person, but hopefully it's sprinkled with a little bit of tongue in cheek or humor here and there. So.
Yeah.
Well,
There
wonderful.
are definitely things that are in some ways dry, like the arguments that I make about the origins of Moses' name literally depends on the evolution of the letter Ayin in Egyptian. If that doesn't put you to sleep instantly, first off, I want your coffee recipe. And secondly, this is the sort of depth we go to try to understand and make these arguments, and hopefully in an entertaining and informative fashion for lay persons as well as professionals.
Have you guys tried audiobooks, like to have your books sort of read by somebody who's a professional?
Yeah, this is something I've been toying with for a long time. I mean, yeah, and actually, I've got someone that helps me on my other YouTube channel who does AI stuff, and he can clone my voice to read it in AI, because I'd love to read my own books, but I just don't have the time. And then you've got to clean up the audio and blah 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 blah. But still, AI. I mean, I write in long, complex sentences, and they require quite a bit of intonation. And AI is just not there yet to be able to do it to the standards that I would like.
It's getting there, though. I can tell you, it's getting there. It's getting there. What was going to say? Have you read Bill Bryson's book, A Brief History About Nearly Everything?
No, I haven't actually, but
yeah, had Aaron. It's a brilliant book. I read it in book form, and then heard it as an audiobook. And the person who's reading the book is wonderful, because there's lots of sense of humor. If not read to you, you would not get the tone of sarcasm, things like that.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. I think Christopher Hitchens reads his own book. I think there are a couple of people that I know who actually read their own books, and it actually makes a huge difference. It's becoming a thing.
I've listened to an awful lot of books by the person who's read them, and I think it makes a heck of a difference if it's read by the person that wrote it, because you can imagine them saying it, but also they know what they've written, and they know, like, intonation is really important for driving home certain points and showing an understanding of what you're saying, that maybe a narrator might not necessarily have as much.
Yeah,
unless there's a really good relationship between the author and reader. So, for example, I've listened to a fair number of audiobooks by the author John Scalzi, and they're read by Will Wheaton of Star Trek Next Generation fame. And Will Wheaton knows how to capture Scalzi's humor and produce that reasonably well. So it's a good synergy there.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Guys, wonderful to have you again. We will speak offline in the next, days and weeks to have a follow-up conversation. But until then, I wish you all the best, and looking forward to reading that book when it's fully in production.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Hanny, for having us on, mate.
See ya.